My name is Roger Buck. Today we're going to be talking about counter-revolution resistance and the Catholic mystery. With this title, obviously, there's a focus on Ireland here, but there'll be more as well, including on France and how French society, thanks in part to massive Muslim immigration, is now fracturing. We'll be suggesting that French developments may reveal counter-revolutionary opportunities for Ireland. But there's more here too, including material on global capitalism and what the French call GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. But there's more as well, including history. We'll be looking at both the French Revolution and counter-revolution, as well as going back to Oliver Cromwell, who long ago mercilessly crushed a Catholic counter-revolution in Ireland. You see here the great seal of that Irish Catholic counter-revolution, which even has the Sacred Heart on it, prefiguring by centuries later Irish devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So, a lot here. There is also an extensive table of contents down below with timestamps to help you navigate through, skipping parts if you like. I should also warn you, there's some material here about myself, who I am, and why I issue this call for non-violent counter-revolution in Ireland. It's my work on this channel and in my books to foster and support Catholic counter-revolution, rightly understood, as we'll be making clear the most genuine expression of Catholic counter-revolution is not about inciting violence. So we're going to be looking at that. We're also going to be looking at the Anglosphere, the Anglo-American world, and as I'll be explaining, I am an Anglo-American myself, given that I was born in America of an English father and an English mother, although my mother had some Irish in her as well. So that, I'm going to suggest here, gives me, I hope, some useful things to say about Ireland's plight as a Catholic country, or at least a culturally Catholic country, sandwiched in between the great, overwhelming, culturally Protestant influence of America and Britain. We'll be referring to the 1916 revolution in Ireland, people like Patrick Pearse, Edmond de Valera, who at that time were very concerned about the Anglicization of Ireland. If they were alive today and horrified by what they would see today, I rather wonder if they would be speaking about the Anglo-Americanization of Ireland. Finally, I just want to point you to my beloved friend whom I never met, beloved mentor I never met, Hilaire Belloc, behind me, because we'll also be bringing Belloc into all of this. Belloc was a great believer in the Irish Revolution, had a lot to say, and we'll be looking at Belloc. I mean, Belloc is really, in my mind, a very, very great Catholic counter-revolutionary thinker, and we'll definitely be drawing on the great Hilaire Belloc today as well. All right, I'd like to begin by speaking a little bit about Catholic counter-revolution in the past, particularly France. I lived for a while in France, and as I've gone into in my books, I became very, very deeply interested in the French counter-revolution. Now, by that, I do not simply mean the violent counter-revolution in the Vendée and the west of France generally, where people rose up against the French revolutionaries and were massacred, genocide of something like 300,000 people in the French West and the Vendée region. No, I don't simply mean that. What I mean is that if you really know a bit about French history, you will see that the French counter-revolution did not stop with the massacre, the genocide of the French. because for something like 150 years, the French kept resisting the revolution. You had like two Frances for something like 150 years. One France was liberal, left-wing, secular, trying to promote the secular vision of the French Revolution. And then you had another France, a France that believed that it was Catholic, that was continuously striving for Catholic counter-revolution for 150 years. Right up to the mid-20th century, I would say. And maybe it's coming back. We'll at least touch on that later on. But right now, historically, this Catholic counter-revolution that existed in France for 150 years is worth noting right now in a couple of ways. First, I want to stress that this 150 years of activity was not really violent. No, it was something else. It was characterized, I would say, by a spirit of fierce resistance to French secularization and French secularism. Fierce resistance. And we need more of that fierce resistance today. But fierce resistance need not be violent. Now, I know there is a tension in what I am speaking about in this episode between certain outbreaks of revolution which have been violent, and, the ideal that I'm pointing to is something that is not violent. But in this fallen, broken world, there's no doubt that violence does happen. And we're not going to get into a whole debate about that tension right now. I'm simply speaking about what I really mean at its most genuine expression by Catholic counter-revolution is a spirit of resistance to the secularizing and materialistic trends of our age. So, I was very hit by that, living in France, and, I was interested in all the manifestations I learned of there, placing the Sacred Heart of Jesus, for example, on the French tricolour flag, just a huge wave of Catholic devotion that spread through places like Paray-le-Monial that I've spoken about on this channel, and Lourdes and La Salette, all through the 19th century and into the 20th century. We need to do a whole episode about this, really. So that really hit me living in France. But what also really hit me is that I became clear that in the Anglo-American world, you never really saw this kind of counter-revolutionary spirit. No, because you could say that, the essential primary culture of England and America was born in a spirit of revolution. It was born in the spirit of the Protestant Revolution. So you start looking at English history or American history, and you don't get anything like, the French fiercely resisting the revolution. So for example, in England, with Oliver Cromwell, finally you got Charles II back on the throne, but compared to the ferocity of the French, Charles II was still going along with so much that Cromwell stood for. And before we, move on from these historical points, I just want to make one more point. Generally, when people speak about Catholic counter-revolution, they are speaking about what was born in France after 1789. But really, you could go back further. You could look at Ireland. Because in Ireland, what Cromwell did to this country, and the incredible massacre and genocide that Cromwell inflicted on Ireland, this was also a response to what you could call Catholic counter-revolution, with the Catholic Confederation that tried to rise up in Ireland in the mid-17th century. We're not going into that today, but it's relevant for what I'm saying about a spirit of Catholic counter-revolution resisting. The Irish continued to resist, long after Cromwell, the spirit of Cromwell. The French continued to resist the French Revolution for a very long time. And at least in my understanding of English and American history and my own Anglo-American culture, I've never really seen something like that intense spirit of resistance. And again, I would suggest that it's born out of this lack of resistance owes a lot to the fact that England and America are so shaped by the Protestant Revolution. So cultures grounded in revolution may not resist revolution in the way the Irish and the French did. At any rate, if you look at the history of Ireland and France, you see generation after generation of people resisting revolution in a way you really don't see in England. Alright, to bring this more into the present century, I'd like to say that back when I was living in France, 2006 to 2009, I don't think I ever really imagined that I would see Catholic counter-revolutionary movement emerging again in Europe in the 21st century in my lifetime. But it seems like I was wrong. As I went into in some detail in an episode called Globalism and the Irish Tragedy, this wasn't just about Ireland, it was obviously about globalism, had a lot about Europe and a lot about France in it. And I was pointing there to, phenomena like the protests in France against so-called same-sex marriage, which attracted up to 1 million people on the streets.
A father and a mother are there to give life, to teach and to pass on. They need a well-established structure to pass on everything to their children.
We are for a sustainable family. We all come from a dad and a mum, and we think it's normal for every child to have the chance to have a dad and a mum.
The demonstration is pretty big because we want to say that trying to impose something from on high, like Mr. Hollande has done with this bill without any real debate, especially for something that upsets the legal organization of the family in France, we think it's really not the time to do this. And to do it in this way divides French people. That's why you see us in such great numbers.
And again, I was making the distinction with the Anglosphere. Britain is a similar sized country to France. You certainly didn't see 1 million people on the streets protesting that there. And, as far as I know, America, which would be 5 times the size of France, didn't have 5 million people, on the streets of Washington, protesting. This again supports my point that the spirit of counter-revolution has always been stronger in Catholic countries. But what I want to really focus on now is that, to my surprise, we are now beginning to see in Ireland movements that could be argued partake of counter-revolution, at least to an extent. Now, it's not my purpose to go into these in detail here on this channel because I'm not really a commentator on current events. But, we could point to Robert Nugent. We could point to some of the kind of protests that farmers have been having in Ireland or against mass migration to protect Irish culture. Now, as far as I know, and my knowledge is limited, there is not much that is religious and Catholic in these things, and I do believe that these movements will be stronger if they are revitalized with Christianity and Catholic Christianity. But without going into those movements, just very broadly speaking, very broad strokes, if you were to understand, revolution as contra traditional patterns of the past and counter-revolution as protesting liberal elites, then you could argue that all of these things, to one extent or another, partake in the spirit of counter-revolution, even if it's just a little. But yeah, to speak about Robert Nugent here, I just want to say something here. I follow Robert's work a little. I don't follow it enough, probably. But I've been very, very moved to see these rallies and these assemblies and these meetings that he's been doing across the country, actually raising the Sacred Heart on the Irish flag, just like the French did 150 years ago. But more to the point, I'm getting reports of people returning to the faith because of what Robert is doing. Evangelizing. And, I'm also going to say, just a bit of digression, I occasionally have heard, criticism of Robert for this, that, or the other thing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, finding fault is the easiest thing in the world to do, because we humans are all filled with incredible faults. All of us are faulty, fallen. I feel there is too much finding fault with all kinds of people. And really, I'd much rather celebrate the zeal and the passion and the closeness that Robert so evidently has to Christ and his church, and what he's doing, I would say, in a counter-revolutionary spirit to revive the Catholic Church in Ireland. What I want to talk about now is what I'm seeing as possibly a new and dramatic moment of opportunity for counter-revolution, both in Ireland and in the West in general. Now, if you start to listen to me, you may be thinking, well, what's new or dramatic about this? Surely what you're saying goes back quite a number of years. It's even old hat, because it may sound that I'm simply speaking about the kind of polarization that we've been witnessing in the West in at least the last 10 years. More, red states versus blue states in America, for example. What I'm saying is about this polarization. It partakes of this polarization, but in my view, it goes further. And I want to tell you, to illustrate this moment of opportunity, that I have been reading a book by a respected French sociologist. I'm going to bring it up on the screen. Please forgive my terrible French pronunciation, not one of my strong points, but the book is called L'Archipel Français, and the subtitle of the book is Naissance d'une nation multiple et divisée. All right? So what's that? Well, the subtitle is obviously Birth of a Nation Multiple and Divided. And the book is a sociological survey of what is happening in France now. And the reason it's called, the French archipelago, is obviously an archipelago is, a group of, physical islands separated from each other. The French archipelago here is islands of culture that are becoming increasingly separated. This is the image that the author is giving, and he's not just speaking about left versus right, which has obviously existed in France since the time of the French Revolution. No, he's going much further than that. Now, before I comment too specifically about this, and its relevance to Ireland, its relevance to the West, I want to just give a slight caveat. I haven't read the entire book yet. The book deserves more careful attention than I've been able to give it, and I'm going to speak about what I'm picking up from the book, and also what I'm picking up from my own observations of French society. But what I've got from the book so far is the impression that the author is looking back to a time in France. I think he's probably lamenting this time back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when France, was far more united under the same kind of monolithic liberal vision of the time. And he's now seeing a situation in France that looks very different to him. This fracturing of France, as I say, not just into left and right, but all kinds of different forms of left and right, and other kinds of islands of French culture. So obviously on the French right you have different varieties of the French right. It's very powerful. You have, a Gaullist right. You have a kind of center right that's, Macron has been able to appeal to. You have an identitarian right, or a racist right. You have the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen. You have many forms on the right, and you have many forms on the left. But he's not just speaking about these different right-wing islands and these different left-wing islands in France. He's pointing to other cultural islands emerging in France. Now, obviously, a major one here is the, Muslim island, or maybe islands. Through massive Muslim, immigration into France. France now has to contend with this mighty factor of, Islam in France in a way that we don't need to do that yet in Ireland. But he's bringing up other islands. For example, when he speaks about the Catholic Church in France, he actually divides it into 3 different islands. He speaks about, a traditionalist island in France where, Latin Mass is so incredibly strong, traditional Catholicism. He also speaks about a charismatic island in France. And he speaks about, I can't remember the name of it, but he has a third kind of, Catholic island. So Catholics of different cultures, different versions of, Catholicism, kind of jostling and competing with each other. He goes into so much here. He has regional, nationalism islands in France, Breton nationalism, Corsican nationalism. I don't really want to get too much into the details of France here because my real point is Ireland and the rest of the West, and I haven't read the book in its entirety yet, but I will just say that, he may well be going into like a feminist island in France, or a New Age island in France. Now I have to say that, as I stress on this channel, the New Age movement that is so powerful in Ireland today and in the Anglosphere is an Anglo-American phenomenon. If there is a New Age island in France, it's going to be very small indeed compared to, the overwhelming power that New Age thinking now has in the Anglosphere. There are no great Oprah Winfrey type people that I'm aware of in France, really transforming, as I've been arguing on this channel, replacing Christianity with the New Age. You don't really have that kind of thing in France yet because France, is sealed off from the Anglo-American world by its language. But really, my point now is this kind of fracturing, not simply right and left, but many, many different cultural visions. And I think there is an opportunity for Ireland here. An opportunity to break Ireland up. I may sound overly celebratory there, ladies and gentlemen, but it's an opportunity for counter-revolution. Don't get me wrong, I'm not happy with the emergence, of a New Age island in Irish culture, or the emergence of a kind of feminist island that simply thinks the church is all down to patriarchal oppression, or the emergence of, Muslim, island in Irish culture, which could get stronger and stronger and stronger. But nonetheless, what we've seen in Ireland recently has been kind of like a monolithic liberalism, at least at the level of the elites, with a kind of hatred of the church, suppressing the church. I celebrate any opportunity to break that monolithic unity up. So, what I'm saying is paradoxical. I'm not celebrating all those other potential Irish islands, but I can see a situation of cultivating a Catholic island in the Greater Ireland, where Catholic tradition is cultivated and maintained and made visible. This last week we've been seeing in Chartres how, Catholic France makes itself visible through these great processions, from Paris to Chartres. And I see Robert Nugent, and others, at least making small beginnings in that direction. I sort of imagine that we could see the rebirth of an island of Catholic culture here in Ireland. Now, some people may say, well, that's not so much to celebrate. Do we just want to be creating a small island? Don't we want to be turning the tide? Well, of course we want to be turning the tide. We want to be turning the tide when we see so many horrendous things, happening in Ireland. When we see, Irish children being raised in, an ethos that is completely contrary to the church, when we see churches closing down, when we see the vocations crisis, when we see, commercial and capitalist Ireland triumphing, obviously we want to turn the tide. But basically, I don't see, ladies and gentlemen, how we're going to get back to Catholic Ireland as it was anytime soon. Really what's happening in France, so many of the foundations for this were laid in France in the 60s and 70s. There were, through the Latin Mass movement and other things, too much to go into now. But what we see in Chartres, places like that now, the renaissance of Catholic culture, and even arguably these protests, all of that rests on efforts made 40 or 50 years ago. So, as a first step, I wanted to encourage thinking about this monolithic unity in Ireland beginning to break down, and thinking about Catholics maintaining an island of Catholic culture within Ireland. And my prayer and my hope, ladies and gentlemen, would be that it would be an island where Catholics of different kinds can cooperate, where traditionalists, can cooperate with, Catholics who may not feel so traditional. I'm never sure what to call these Catholics. A handy label in Europe is charismatic, but not everyone wants to be labelled. And moreover, my friend Charles Coulombe recently brought it to my attention, I didn't know this, that charismatic Catholic in America means speaking in tongues and things like that, the likes of which I've never heard of or seen in Europe. But basically, I mean that there are, all across Ireland, some very, very deeply devotional and beautiful Catholics, very pious, who aren't necessarily drawn to the Latin Mass in the way that I most certainly am. You see some of these people interacting on a forum here we have in Ireland called the Mother of God, and I have long felt the piety in that forum. I've long found it very moving. So many different kinds of Catholics in Ireland. I obviously believe that the liturgy is central to everything. But even if I have disagreements with other kinds of, Catholic friends, we should be working together. We need to start rebuilding Catholic culture on this island. And, I will also say that I would hope that this would very much hark back to the kind of Catholic and Gaelic Ireland that emerged after the Easter Rising, through the efforts of Pearse and De Valera, and we'll be coming to Pearse, De Valera, even James Connolly later in the episode, because I think it's important to recall that Catholic Gaelic Ireland that emerged then and clear away a lot of the terrible misconceptions about that. But right now, my point is we need to start rebuilding. What I'm really thinking that I want to do with the rest of my life, if it is God's will, is work for a little island in Ireland, hopefully, as large as it can be, on this island in the Irish archipelago, the emerging Irish archipelago, as Ireland fractures as well, that is holding Catholic culture and holding Catholic tradition. That's what I want to foster in my books and on this channel. It's what I mean by working for a Catholic counter-revolution in Ireland. It's why I want to celebrate other people like Robert Nugent, who are doing that in more dynamic ways than I can. My work, I think, is really fostering this, through my books and videos. But I want to join with people in Ireland who are fostering this breakup of Ireland into an Irish archipelago of different islands, and really cultivating an Irish island of Catholic resistance. Alright, Here is maybe a place to point out that none of this is new for me. I've been trying in my own, modest way to foster this for quite a number of years. And a significant marker point of that is the book you see behind me, The Gentle Traditionalist, which is a fictional set of dialogues about the state of tradition, the state of the globalist world, and also it's got a strong Irish component to it as well. We're not going to go into the fiction part of the book right now, which is the main part of the book, the fictional dialogues, but I'd like to read you some sections from my non-fiction introduction to the book, written getting on for 10 years ago now. And we'll be expanding on them, maybe updating them a little bit, commenting on them, but hopefully you'll see what I'm getting at. And although it might be a little repetitious, we're going to start with what I was writing 10 years ago about counter-revolution. So, I'm going to read, and then I'm going to expand a bit. Different people mean different things by counter-revolution. For some, it primarily signifies violent resistance to the 1789 French Revolution and other revolutions that broke out in Catholic countries later, such as Spain, Italy, various nations in Latin America and elsewhere. Indeed, in Ireland, as we shall see, there were numerous Catholic uprisings against the Protestant British, which, it seems to me, also possess a counter-revolutionary spirit, even if they are not usually designated as such. In all instances, Catholics took up arms to defend their culture against the onslaught of forces owing to revolution, whether it was the original Protestant Revolution or later revolutions, like Cromwell. However, I go on to say, a much broader and more profound understanding of Catholic counter-revolution is possible. As the devout, Frenchman, Joseph de Maistre, wrote after the 1789 revolution, which killed the French royal family, not to mention the genocide I referred to earlier. So de Maistre, we're quoting de Maistre now. He's predicting a return to order. And he says, the return to order will not be painful, because it will be natural, and because it will be favored by a secret force whose action is wholly creative. Those of you who know my Tomberg videos may get a sense of something similar here, with a secret force whose action is wholly creative. Instead of these violent commotions, painful divisions, and perpetual and desperate oscillations, a certain stability, an indefinable peace, a universal well-being will announce the presence of, he means the return of the King. This is the great truth which the French cannot be too greatly impressed. What they call the counter-revolution will not be a contrary revolution, but the contrary of revolution. This is important. For de Maistre, a genuine counter-revolution is not effected through violence. For this would mean nothing more than a second revolution of the same substance as the first. For him, we repeat, a genuine counter-revolution will be, quote, precisely the opposite of what we have seen, he means in 1789, entailing, quote, a secret force whose action is wholly creative. Personally, all this puts me in mind of prayer and the holy sacraments of the Church, as well as sacramentals like the Rosary, holy water, and consecrating the home to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, all of which are fundamental to the Catholic culture which once thoroughly pervaded Ireland. De Maistre, I'm sure, would concur. He was instrumental in forging a profoundly Catholic counter-revolutionary current of thinkers and pious people who desperately sought an alternative to the secular, materialistic ethos that has now triumphed in today's world. Prayer and sacrifice are then key things to Catholic counter-revolution. Okay, I'm going to expand on that. And I'm going to expand by saying that I was fortunate recently to get to Latin Mass again in Belfast, where Monsignor Vac, the founder of the Institute, gave a homily which for me was, I think it's going to be unforgettable. He was really calling us to prayer, but using the traditional forms of prayer, but praying not mechanically, but with a spirit of deep sincerity and intensity. I was incredibly moved by Monsignor Vac's homily. To give a little tribute now to the Institute of Christ the King, I see that institute has been built on prayer, and it's very moving. And even though I know this, I needed to hear it more deeply. It's like, I think why Monsignor Vac's homily was so moving to me is that I could see that, because I've, encountered him briefly in the past and, I know the Institute a bit, I can see that this man has dedicated his life to building up an institute, Latin Mass celebrating institute, so much through prayer. And again, one of the things that I celebrate about the Institute of Christ the King is the spirit of charity I find there. And I do want to be commenting in this video with a little bit of concern about all kinds of people finding fault with other kinds of people. I want to see in Ireland a movement, with a little less fault finding. I find fault too. I'm not immune to this tendency by any means. But my prayer for Ireland would be, the people in Ireland who are charismatics, who are like on the so-called, we'll say, charismatic island in Ireland, would join forces with the people maybe on the emerging traditionalist island in Ireland, and not so much find fault with each other, but work to serve and defend the church. And what I'm saying here in this introduction is that prayer and sacrifice, the Mass, liturgy, the Rosary, holy water, holy water used to be in, so many Catholic homes. Who knows what the effect of having holy water in the home and sprinkling on fields, or the Rosary, and praying it with your heart. Pray for Ireland. Pray the Rosary. Bless your home with holy water. Return to Irish Catholic traditions. I hope that we are going to do this, and if we do it prayerfully, we may awaken what Joseph de Maistre calls a secret force, whose action is wholly creative. Now, as I've been bringing up here already, there is a tension here, between violent counter-revolution, and who's to say, when a people are really oppressed or being massacred, like the Vendéans, or the people who opposed the French Revolution, I don't want to stand in judgment or find fault of people in circumstances I can't possibly imagine. I'm really pointing to a tension. And I say a bit more about this in the book, and I'm just going to read you this. We will not further engage the tension between de Maistre's view and the tragic warfare that has rarely, but occasionally, characterized counter-revolution. Let us simply say that counter-revolution entailed intense resistance from Catholics who could not bear the suppression of their culture. Our Catholic culture in Ireland is being suppressed, and we need to resist. And the resistance can take many forms. Above all, prayer, I would say. At its best, there was intensity of prayer and sacrifice, rather than intensity of violence. Does this mean then that all the counter-revolutionary wars were unjustified? How can any mere human say? Only God can judge what Catholics in the past went through and what they did, whilst everything precious to them was being destroyed. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I'm hoping to say a lot more about 1916 on this channel, and a lot more about Patrick Pearse and Edmond de Valera, people like this who do move me very, very deeply. And one of the things I'm going to be saying is that we people of today find it very, very hard to imagine what Ireland was like when there was this incredible poverty in Dublin, like, you know, maybe almost no other city in Europe. You know, when you saw people you loved dying in poverty, dying in disease, when you really saw, you know, that so much of this did owe to the British in Ireland. There are huge, huge subjects here that I intend to, you know, I hope to go into in future episodes. My point now is really that, yes, counter-revolution sometimes has taken violent forms, and I don't want to judge that, and yet I want to say at the same time, you know, what is most genuine about counter-revolution is prayer. Edmond de Valera, for example, was a man of intense prayerfulness. That is what is key and essential. But we're not going to dwell on that right now, that tension anymore. You know, some people may say, well, there's a contradiction there. I prefer to think of it as a tension, and that we really need to ponder the tension. Coming back to my introduction, I've written that if all this sounds exotic to you, this brings us neatly to the point. I know these things are now strange and unfamiliar to many people in Anglican American culture particularly. Indeed, my life's experience points me to this conclusion. English and American culture has conspired, sometimes innocently, sometimes not, to ensure these matters remain obscure within the Anglosphere. The Catholic mystery is simply blanked out by the vast majority of our Anglo-American media. And it is Anglo-American media, from British rock to Hollywood to what the French call GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, that now dominates the planet. I'm going to say, of course, it now dominates Ireland. And I am aware that in starting off a video locating contemporary things happening in Ireland, like I have done here, within the context of Catholic counter-revolution, may well seem or sound exotic to many people. And that's a sad thing, because it shouldn't sound exotic. This is a result, in large measure, of Ireland now being blanketed by Anglo-American media. If you go to France, you know, even very secular France, all the French know about the counter-revolution in France. I've mentioned this before. You know, French comic books are about French history, including, I've seen comic books on the Vendée, you know, about the counter-revolution. If you go to Catholic countries like France, there will be an awareness of these things. But in a world of Ireland where all our media, or so much of our media, either comes from the Anglo-American world or is profoundly influenced by the Anglo-American world, we're in danger of losing things like this. I mean, I wonder how many of my viewers really realize that Oliver Cromwell's genocide in Ireland was trying to crush a counter-revolutionary movement, the Catholic Confederation of Kilkenny. I wonder how many people really know. I think even things about 1916 are being terribly misrepresented. And that's something I want to address on this channel. Look, I'm just going to say right now, we're going to come back to this at the end of this channel, but there's a book I want to promote here called The Saga of Ireland, because it's a very useful history of Ireland from a traditional Catholic perspective rather than a secular, academic and materialistic perspective, because secular and academic books are so often deeply materialistic. So we're coming back to this, but my point now is that I'm concerned about the Irish losing touch with their own history in a way that the French never would, and losing touch with their history, like the history I'm invoking here, sounding exotic, because, you know, in all kinds of ways, we're now filled with this Anglo-Americanization in Ireland. Moving on. If my criticisms of Anglo-American culture seem sharp or excessive, I hope to be granted a little leeway, inasmuch as I stem from this sphere myself. For my roots are both in England and America. My parents were English, but I was born in America. I grew up in both countries, thus I sometimes say that I am quintessentially Anglo-American. So we're bringing in a bit of autobiography here, but you'll see it's relevant. And in my case, at least, my Anglo-American heritage worked to utterly obscure the true nature of the Catholic Church. I hardly think I am alone in this. Like most of my fellow Brits and Americans, my patrimony is mainly Protestant, even if I was not raised as one. I'm going to explain this here. You know, I was not raised as a Protestant, although my mother later on did convert to evangelical, American-style kind of Christianity. But even though this wasn't really part of my childhood, I see that it all seeped into me. And I really had no idea what the Catholic mystery was. Nearly everything I experienced growing up of Christianity was Protestant, including the ranting televangelists I saw on my American TV, as I say, my mother began to watch. Frankly, it all seemed dull, limited, and literalist to me. I never realized that Christianity encompassed so much more than this. Only much later did I see that Protestantism accounted for less than 30% of Christianity worldwide, far smaller than the vast sacramental territory occupied by Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Well, that was written 10 years ago, and Protestantism has been growing in much of the world, so those figures are maybe no longer quite true, but this is my point. For me, growing up in America, or in England, you think that the Protestant tradition is the main tradition because it's the main tradition in the Anglosphere. You go out to the rest of the world and you see that, you know, Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, you know, sacramental Christianity are the, you know, the main factors here. So, you know, you grow up in England or America, as I did, and even if you're not raised as a Protestant, you're absorbing Protestant ideas of Christianity. I never really had any idea of what a sacrament is. I had no idea of the Catholic Church. What I saw of Christianity was televangelists, you know, ranting. As I'm going to explain, this had the effect of driving me into the New Age, because I saw nothing mysterious or meaningful in the kind of Protestant Christian ethos that I grew up in a very sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant part of Oregon on the west coast of America. You know, I saw nothing of the Catholic mystery. My fear now is that this is starting to happen in Ireland with all of this Anglo-American media, which even if it is not explicitly Protestant, is still marinated in a kind of cultural Protestantism, as far as I can see. You know, I'm beginning to see indicators that the Irish are taking on Protestant notions of Christianity from the Anglo-American media, and they don't really know what the Catholic mystery is. This is very important, I think. I also feel that it is going to have the same effect of driving the Irish into the New Age. All right, before moving on, I just want to quote you something that's quoted in another one of my books, my Big Court Jesu book. And what I want to quote to you is a letter that a young Irishman wrote to me, this is only like 10 years ago, speaking about his generation. He had, I think, found his way back to the Catholic faith when he wrote me this, gave me kind permission to quote him anonymously, but clearly he had been failed in his youth. So, this young man wrote to me, "Unfortunately, I wouldn't be too optimistic about the faith's prospects in Ireland, and I don't think it's just my gloomy temperament. Among my own generation of 20-somethings, there is contempt or indifference. Religious education programs are fatuous. I certainly didn't take it seriously then. Virtually no one of my generation has been catechized in any meaningful way. My friends' ideas about Christianity are often ideas picked up from American TV, which actually refer to Protestantism." Goes on to say that he sees something different in the rural West, but even along the west coast of Ireland, which I regard as the last bastion of civilization, the new generation is being mentally and spiritually shaped by Anglo-American media culture. Just to be fair to Anglo-American culture, obviously he's invoking different factors here. There's the failure of the Irish bishops, there's the failure of Irish catechesis. There are many factors in the mix here, including, I would very much suggest, Vatican II. I don't just want to pin this all on the Anglo-American media culture, but I found it very telling that in speaking to his 20-year-old something friends, what they were thinking about Christianity wasn't Catholicism, it was Protestant stuff that they had picked up from the Anglo-American world. And because I grew up in that world, and I know what I was given about Christianity really drove me to the New Age, I am concerned. We're going to just continue reading with a bit more autobiography from my Gentle Traditionalist book, and I go on to say that I had no idea what a sacrament even was, nor indeed of many other sublime things preserved in Catholic worship. Knowing nothing of the Catholic mystery, I sought out New Age mysteries, the thrill of the esoteric. I do not think I am alone in this. In England and America particularly, many spiritually sensitive folk, seeing nothing sublime in a Christianity they find boring, turn to the New Age. This is what happened to me, ladies and gentlemen. I saw nothing sublime. I turned to the New Age. The Christianity of these televangelists struck me as just boring, ranting, crazy, said nothing to my soul. I do want to dwell on this a little bit. And I tell you, we're going to go into this more in an upcoming episode or upcoming episodes. It's very hard to nail down the effect of the New Age in Ireland. Partly because the New Age, as I say, is such an amorphous and difficult to define phenomenon. But even though we cover it soon in an upcoming episode, I just want to make reference to something I saw in the Irish Times. And it said that in the Republic, Catholic weddings were down to 35%. People choosing to be married. 35%. So that begs the question of what are the other weddings? Well, it said that 1% were Church of Ireland, that's the Protestant, church here in Ireland, obviously. It then had numbers that were quite significant for like civil weddings that were humanist in orientation. As I say, we're going into this in another episode. They were very, very substantial. Didn't list Jewish or Muslim weddings, but it listed 8% of weddings for something called the Spiritualist Union of Ireland. That's obviously New Age. I checked it out, but it's clearly New Age. And then it listed 20% other religious ceremonies. And I want to make this clear. This is not non-religious ceremonies of a civil nature. This is other religious ceremonies. 20%. Well, what would they be? Well, there's 1 or 2% of Muslims in the country, so maybe some of those are Islamic. It's probably less than 1% of Jews. Maybe a few of them are Jewish, but that's only like 2 or 3%. I think it's safe to bet that of that 20%, the other religious ceremonies will be at least New Agey in some way. Data is hard to come by, but with Ireland's immersion in the Anglo-American culture in a way, again, that the French aren't immersed in it, you don't really get the New Age again in France, not the way you get it here. Irish spirituality is being turned from Catholic Christianity to paganism and the New Age, and it's serious, and it's something that owes a great deal to the Anglo-American culture that I come from. And I rather fancy, ladies and gentlemen, that I can see this possibly in a different way, maybe in a sharper way than many Irish people. I sometimes say things about this to Irish friends, about how powerful I see the Anglo-American media here, and they're often surprised. Maybe some of them think I have a bee in my bonnet. I'm aware that what I'm saying, you're not going to hear on other YouTube channels. Again, so many YouTube channels, Catholic channels, are coming from the American world. You're not going to hear that kind of critique of the Anglo-American media on many American Catholic channels, no matter how good they are. So it's like, I sometimes struggle to make my point here. Like, I sometimes feel people aren't hearing me on the merits of what I'm saying at its worst. It's like I'm saying something they haven't heard before, and maybe sometimes I fear, I don't know if it's true, people are scratching their heads and saying, well, are other people saying the same thing? And if they aren't, well, I'm concerned that people might be, consulting the groupthink, rather than hearing what I'm saying on its own merits. But you take it or you leave it. This is my experience of somebody who was culturally steeped in Anglo-American Protestantism, not having a clue about the Catholic mystery, drifting to the New Age, and I do think that this is a serious factor now, influencing Ireland, and I have to speak out about it. Coming back to a bit of autobiography in my Gentle Traditionalist book here, I speak about how everything changed for me when I was 34 years old. Or just before my 34th birthday. However, I had a conversion experience, the fruits of which would eventually liberate me from my accumulated layers of New Age ideology. But rather than go into that, my point here as I write is that my Anglo-American background blinded me to what has become the greatest joy of my life, participation in the holy mystery of the Catholic Church. What obscured my vision was both the Protestant images and stereotypes of Christianity I saw, as well as the secular and New Age ideology which now permeates the Anglo-American world. All this rendered Catholicism opaque to me, as it does to countless other Anglophones. It may help if I add that my English parents bore significant anti-Catholic bias, rampant in my mother, very, very ferociously anti-Catholic, but also subtly present in my gentle father. After my conversion, I tried to understand how my parents' prejudice arose. I concluded it was not their fault. Okay? And here in the book, I turn to, beloved Belloc, the beloved mentor whom I never knew. But here in the book we have a long quote from Belloc that we're going to read, writing 100 years ago, still in all kinds of ways relevant today. So here I'm quoting Belloc. Belloc writes, "With the exception of Ireland, the area covered by English speech, that is, Great Britain, the Dominions and the United States have a character of their own so far as the Catholic Church is concerned. So by the Dominions at that time, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, were dominions of the British Empire. So that's what he's speaking about there. All these have a character of their own. The English-speaking world, Belloc writes, though now morally broken up, had a common root. Its institutions at their origin sprang from the English Protestant 17th century. The American social groups arose, for the most part, as emigrant colonies with a definitely religious origin. The Puritans who founded America, what Charles Coulombe calls Puritan's empire, and nearly all of them with an origin strongly anti-Catholic. Belloc is right, Charles Coulombe is right here. All right, I think it's maybe worth pausing at this moment with Belloc to say something in reference to what Charles Coulombe says about Puritan's empire. Here is his big book on the topic. He spent many years working on this, A History of America from a Catholic Perspective. Charles is, I'm sure, building on Belloc to an extent here, although he brings his own fascinating and rich insights into America that Belloc would never have had. But I think it's an important book for understanding these things. I said earlier that maybe a lot of American Catholic YouTubers would not be aware of the effect of American culture on Europe or American Protestant culture on Europe. Things I'm trying to say here, Charles Coulombe would be a grand exception to that. He's been one of my teachers over the years, as well as a friend, a real inspiration to me. And I think this book has a lot going for it. Charles is really speaking about, what Belloc's speaking about, that this original Puritan kind of matrix, cultural matrix, survives in America. You still have, the same kind of anti-Catholic attitudes there, a certain kind of Calvinism associated with materialist and capitalist success. I would argue that, some of the kind of hysterical political correctness that we see coming out of America, maybe to be fair, I should really say hysterical political correctness coming out of the American universities, the cultural left in America, that would be more fair. But this kind of hysterical political correctness we see, also has roots in America's Puritan culture. And Charles is bringing all kinds of things like that out in the book. Really, you could look at the British Empire that ruled the world for centuries as religiously Anglican. We've spoken before about how people spoke about the Tory party in Britain as the Church of England at prayer. So you have a very kind of Anglican flavour to the British Empire, and Charles is making the point that you have a very Puritan flavour to the American Empire. And these things still persist with their anti-Catholicism, even though it's more subtle today. Anyway, let's go back to Belloc, back to my introduction here. Belloc writes, in England, Scotland, and Wales, the Catholic Church had been defeated by 1605. This is obviously the Gunpowder Plot, where the British still celebrate Guy Fawkes Day, sort of anti-Catholic festival you have in Britain. And then Belloc says, it was by 1688, no more than a seventh or an eighth of England in numbers, much less in Scotland, and in both countries failing. Let's also pause about 1688. Why is Belloc emphasizing 1688? It's a very key date. It's the date of the so-called Glorious Revolution in Britain. All right? And basically what happened then is that you had James II ascend to the throne of England, and James II was still a real king then. He wasn't, one of the kind of kings who were just a figurehead, kings and queens like we have today in England. Anyway, James II ascended the throne, and horror of horrors, he was a Catholic convert. And the kind of Protestant elites, Protestant capitalist elites in Britain couldn't bear this. Now, they sort of reassured themselves that James II was without an heir, so hopefully everything would go back to normal. You'd have a Protestant king again in England. but then James II produced a son. And at least the way Belloc is arguing, and I think there is a great deal of truth to it, it was then necessary to depose James II, the last Catholic king of England, also Ireland. It was necessary to depose him by, the kind of Protestant capitalist ruling elite there. I mean, to be fair, there would be all kinds of people who weren't part of that capitalist elite, just Anglicans, who were horrified by Catholicism by that point, horrified by the papists. So it wasn't simply about the ruling British Protestant elite. But Belloc really makes the case, and I think there's a great deal to be said for it, that this ruling elite felt their growing capitalist interests threatened, and it was necessary for them to depose James II and bring in, a Protestant king, William of Orange, who would then be more amenable to their capitalist interests. And this is really the point. After 1688, where, the kings of England no longer have power, they become simply figureheads for the growing capitalist British Empire. Belloc would really argue that they, are puppets. They are puppets, for the capitalists. They are puppets for the banks. The English banking system, capitalism, really takes off at this point. This is, the so-called glorious revolution. And one asks, where this term glorious revolution came from. And it's easy, at least for me, to suspect that it came from capitalist or Protestant propaganda way back in 1688. Alright, a little digression here. I didn't know I was going to do this, but maybe it's worthwhile interrupting Belloc here to point out that 1688, of course, had tremendous and tragic consequences for Ireland. When James II was deposed, he fled to Ireland, tried to mount a last stand there, defeated at the Battle of the Boyne, by William of Orange, who became, the new Protestant king of Britain. From there you had all the penal laws, took on a terrible, terrible intensity in Ireland. So 1688 was a terrible, terrible tragedy for Ireland. I want to bring that in. I think it's also worth saying that Belloc really sees 1688 as a major date in all of Western history, because it's not simply the time when Catholicism is finally defeated in Britain, as we're going to come to. He's going on to say that this sort of Protestant matrix establishes itself very firmly in Britain, and then that radiates out again to the dominions, to the American colonies. A huge topic here, but look, at the risk of digressing too much, we're going to make a plug for another book. And this is Belloc's book, Monarchy, recently republished by Aroka Press. I was honored to do the introduction for this book, long 40-page introduction that I did for it. A great honor, where I'm really addressing what Belloc said about how 1688 changed the world. Because in Belloc's reading, after 1688, British capitalism arose triumphant, and the French monarchy, which was very much challenged there, was trying to stand against capitalism. This is too much of a digression, so we will simply say that Belloc, who started out in favor of the French Revolution in his youth, which killed the king, obviously, in his old age turned to monarchy as a defense against capitalism and a defense against the banks, that then began to rule in an almighty way, the way Belloc illustrates here, in the Anglosphere. And that's what this book, Monarchy, is all about. I was very honored to write the introduction. We'll put a link to that down below, as well as the Saga of Ireland book. But let's get back to what Belloc is saying about how this kind of post-1688 Protestant matrix that emerges in Britain, with Catholicism defeated in Ireland, and in the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the American colonies. Belloc writes that, after 1688, Catholicism in Britain dwindled to a tiny fragment, about 1%, and that pitiful atom was of no account in the national life nor of any effect on national institutions. From such a source came, obviously, first the colonial system of America, next that of the dominions. Now, because Belloc is nuanced and careful, he goes on to qualify this. He says, of course, so general a statement needs modification. South Africa, one of the dominions, was Dutch, but we won't go into Belloc's qualifications right now, but Belloc is a nuanced thinker. But he goes on to say, in outline, the generalization is true. The stuff of all this culture, this, Anglosphere culture, was one from which Catholicism had been driven out. Until the mid-19th century, so the 1840s, 1850s, the time of the Irish famine, the United States, Great Britain, and her colonies had little need to reckon with the faith, the Catholic faith, within their own boundaries. Up until this time, America, Canada, Britain were immensely Protestant cultures. Jane Austen is a famous author at this point in British history, just before the Irish famine that changed everything. And even if you only know the recent, BBC or movie adaptations of Jane Austen with their picture of a rather stiff, prim and proper Protestant society, you can still get a sense of this British world that Belloc describes, where Catholicism had been almost entirely driven out, reduced to maybe 1% of the population, and which was very much dominated by a Protestantism that saw itself as superior to a superstitious Catholicism. Then Belloc goes on to say, in our time, all that has largely changed. The chief agent of the change has been the Irish people, dispersed by the famine. They brought a large Catholic body into England, Australasia, Canada, and America. I hope we'll come back to this. It's not digressing too much to go into this right now, but what the Irish did abroad in America, the Irish pretty much built the American church. It wasn't the Poles there, it wasn't the Germans. Obviously, these people made efforts, but the Irish emerged in America, building churches up and down the country. But come back to what I write here. Belloc is saying then that Catholic Ireland accepted the cultural roots of virtually the entire Anglosphere are thoroughly pervaded by Protestantism. Yes. And, just to bring this back to the personal dimension, 1688 is key here. How much of my mother and father's anti-Catholicism, how much was that due to this victory in 1688 and the kind of intense anti-Catholic propaganda that then really flowed from 1688. My mother and father, who had, very little Christianity left in them when I was growing up. This real anti-Catholicism. My father later turned to the New Age as well as me. How much of that is down to the so-called glorious revolution of 1688? A huge question, my friends. Key point that we're getting at here is that at this point, almost the entire English-speaking culture becomes a Protestant culture with virtually no Catholicism left in it, with the exception of Ireland. Although that needs to be qualified because Ireland at this time is only partly English-speaking. The dominant language of the country is still Irish. English, of course, is spoken in the Pale, the eastern part of the country and certain other places that Protestantism is arising in. We have the expression, of course, beyond the Pale, meaning the English, in Ireland saw as these terrible, Catholic Gaels that they thought had horrible habits and so on, beyond the Pale. So beyond the pale, that expression, refers to Irish-speaking Catholicism, in the west and south of Ireland at the time. Moving on, going back to my book. Moreover, I write, before Irish immigration began, this is into the, rest of the Anglosphere, Belloc notes how the Anglosphere was severed from Catholicism in a manner different from great Protestant societies elsewhere. For example, German and Dutch culture always had to contend with significant Catholic populations, whether in Catholic Austria or Bavaria, or in the large proportion of Catholics remaining in Holland. So basically, this is just saying that, if you're a Dutch person or a German person, you'll be aware of Catholicism because you have Catholic states like Bavaria. Or if you're in the Netherlands, there's still a significant Catholic population there. But so Catholicism remained familiar to those speaking German and Dutch, whereas for English speakers at this time, again, outside of Ireland, English speakers in, America, Canada, Britain, and so forth, Catholicism became something remote, not to mention endlessly ridiculed. And Belloc argues that this fact, the fact that Catholicism outside of Ireland became unknown in the Protestant Anglosphere, or largely unknown, because it was just such a tiny thing. Belloc's arguing that that had a very significant effect. We're going to now we're quoting Belloc again. Where the character of Catholicism is familiar to all, holding an ancient historic position, and where large Catholic societies of the same blood and speech lie just over the frontiers, like if you're in Germany, but Catholicism is just across the border in Catholic Austria. There, he writes, Catholic literature, ideas, history are known. Catholicism became unknown in the American colonies largely. And Belloc writes, but in the English-speaking world, it is otherwise. There, Catholicism re-entered late as an alien phenomenon. He means again after the Irish famine. After the character of society had become set in an anti-Catholic mold. There, in the Anglosphere, he means all national literature, tradition, law, and especially history were long settled in the anti-Catholic mood before the first recrudescence of Catholicism appeared. Belloc was outraged that the history that he was taught at Oxford, the history, was just permeated by what he saw, and I think rightly so, as Protestant propaganda. And he set out to try to correct that. And I am, among countless other peoples, incredibly indebted to his lifelong effort to create a history that isn't steeped in that propaganda and isn't steeped in materialism. Anyway, therefore it is inevitable that the Catholic body within this English-speaking world should breathe an air which is not its own. So Catholics in the Anglosphere, he's saying, Ireland apart, are breathing an air, a Protestant air. They can't help it. It's all around them. It's different in Holland and Germany. But in America, you'd be breathing this air, which is not its own, and should be more affected by a non-Catholic or anti-Catholic spirit than could be possible in the other Protestant nations, wherein an ancient Catholic culture, still existed with unbroken traditions. Again, he means Germany. Similarly, the great body of, means continental literature in Catholic culture is closed to these minorities of Catholics in the English-speaking world. So, if you're a Catholic, in England at the time he's writing, you don't, speak German, you don't speak French, this Catholic literature was cut off from you. he's basically saying that, the English and the Americans get nearly all their news and more than half their ideas from papers anti-Catholic in direction. So Belloc is talking about the anti-Catholic media in the Anglosphere 100 years ago. It was more intense then, but it still exists. The books which make the mind of the nation help to make the mind of its Catholic minority. And that literature is, in its bulk, vividly anti-Catholic. I think it's undeniable that 100 years ago, when Belloc was writing these things, that literature was incredibly anti-Catholic in a way that maybe not all of us can imagine today. But I'm suggesting that influence, was transmitted to my parents, it was transmitted to me, and indeed, in the kind of Protestant evangelical culture that my mother gravitated to just before she died, that was also, intensely anti-Catholic in America. Yeah, I'd come to England, but I went back to America to look after my mother. Finally left America in 1985. But I had this kind of blast in America of evangelical Protestant Christianity, and yeah, I guess it marked me for life. All right, I laugh and I am concerned about being uncharitable and dismissive towards American Protestantism, because to be fair, I celebrate anything that maintains awareness of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I also want to say that when I went back to America to look after my mother, who was dying of cancer, returned from England, she was really receiving a great deal of very loving and charitable help from these evangelical American Protestants. So there is goodness everywhere. Nonetheless, I take this as a serious thing. What Belloc is saying, these, evangelical Protestants that I, came to know, had quite a blast with them, as I say, in their anti-Catholicism. That anti-Catholicism wasn't their fault either. Like Belloc is saying, they'd grown up in an American Protestant culture that was so cut off from Catholicism, cut off from the Catholic mystery. And although I don't want to laugh or dismiss, good people, good American Christians, I want to say that this is serious. And if these Protestant ideas are informing, in one way or another, so much of the American media that we have in Ireland, or informing the New Age culture, which of course just rejects the church, thinking that the church is basically Protestant, having not a clue about the Catholic mystery. We now have all this New Age literature in Ireland forming people's minds, and that New Age literature is actually, to a large extent, as I argue elsewhere, born out of a rejection of, American Protestant Christianity. We go into that in other episodes, how the New Age, is in some ways like the illegitimate child of the Protestant culture of the Anglosphere. It's like a rebellious, reactive child. And maybe I was a rebellious, reactive child, because huge topics here. Huge topics, and I'm going too far from the point. So let me just come back to Belloc. Or rather, let me just come back to a bit more from my introduction to the Gentle Traditionalist book, where I do continue a bit in an autobiographical vein, really pointing out that things began to change for me when I sort of finally left the Anglo-American world behind. So to be clear, I spent most of the first, 34, 35 years of my life, well, not most, all, either growing up in America and growing up in England. Later on, I was in Scotland, the New Age community of Scotland. Later on, I was in Cambridge, England. I'd never really gone beyond the sort of Anglo-American world. But here I wrote, it was only after my conversion that I could fully begin to appreciate, I'm saying, what Belloc is getting at here. For I spent some years living in culturally Catholic countries, Ireland, Spain, France, lands steeped in Catholic thinking, literature, arts, and more. These were, in short, countries where the Catholic mystery is visible. in a way very, very different to the England or America, I'd grown up in. For me, all this confirmed Belloc's view of the tunnel vision of the formerly Protestant, now secular Anglo-American world. I recall something on the English internet, reading this, where the writer spoke of how the Roman Catholic Church, I'm sure that's what he called it, had once been, quote, the mainstream church of the West, quote. French or Spanish writers would never say anything like this, because to them it's obvious that the Catholic Church is still the mainstream church in the West. It's still the dominant church. It's only, in the Anglo-American world that you can kind of think that the Catholic Church is no longer the mainstream church. Catholicism, ladies and gentlemen, is the mainstream. It's the dominant form of Christianity on this planet, but you can grow up living in America or England and think, well, it used to be the mainstream, but it isn't any longer. So I write, in the Anglosphere, it is all too easily assumed that mainstream Christianity equals Protestant. And it doesn't. Anglo-American culture has robbed people of understanding the Catholic world. The Catholic world which dwarfs it. We now face a grave situation whereby Anglo-American culture dominates the planet. All this has been poignant and painful for me since coming to live in Ireland. I am gravely concerned for the fate of Catholic Ireland, overwhelmed as it is by the two cultures from which I stem. Daily, I ask how the Irish spiritual genius can be preserved so that Ireland does not simply become a second-rate clone of the Anglo-American world. This is what I fear, ladies and gentlemen, Ireland becoming a clone. I will also point out that the leaders of the Irish Revolution, you could argue counter-revolution, those who mounted a counter-revolution in Ireland were concerned about the same issues. They wanted a Catholic Gaelic civilization, not an Anglo-Protestant civilization. I'll be saying more about that. Some people may wonder if I excessively blame my own countries of origin. What of homegrown Irish cultural and political leaders who have steered Ireland on her present course? Clearly, people like Enda Kenny and Leo Varadkar have a lot to answer for. Obviously, there are also other factors destroying Irish Catholic culture. Most notably, the appalling sexual abuse that occurred in Ireland has taken its toll. Clearly, an entire complex of issues is at work, rather than simply Anglo-Americanization. Nonetheless, it is often remarked how much the young have transformed Irish culture, abandoning the faith of their fathers. And the young, along with by now middle-aged Irish elites, have grown up in an age wherein Ireland became awash in British and American media like never before. Thus, for example, the rock stars who pervaded these generations' formative years were above all British, but also American. And they were not from Catholic cultures like Italy, France, or Spain, or indeed from Ireland for the most part. No, what Ireland is only now thoroughly awash in is the Anglo-American culture. Being British and American myself, I cannot help but feel acutely conscious of how much my own culture has thoroughly pervaded this country. Thus, I also sadly note the majority of newspapers the Irish read are of British origin. And on the rare occasions I watch Irish television, something hits me in the guts. Just how many English or American productions I see. It runs the gamut from talk shows and Hollywood blockbusters to soap operas and cartoons. Everything from Oprah Winfrey to The Simpsons. Yes, we can't, exonerate Leo Varadkar, Simon Harris, these kinds of leaders, but they were also formed in this globalized culture of Ireland, and as I've argued in the last episode, what we really mean by globalization in Ireland is above all Anglo-Americanization. Because, as I said last time, there's no great Russification of Ireland, there's no great, Chinification of Ireland. Yes, we have mass immigration now, and I'm not denying that there are problems there. But does this mass immigration really compare with the Anglo-Americanization of Ireland that I'm trying to point to here? And yet I see few Catholic commentators in Ireland really pointing to. I'm going to bring up something. I've got something up here on the screen. This is from a secular Irish commentator, I think. Zip codes, TV shows, and brunch. Ireland is a land of copycats. And the subtitle is, Ireland just can't stop copying Americanisms. And we're just going to read one paragraph from her. There are many American traditions that we slowly adopt over the years. Nickelodeon had a lot to answer for in the late 1990s as Irish children began to develop inexplicably strong US accents, and the country was met with an epidemic of juvenile eye-rolling and answering whatever to almost everything. I have strong memories of saying duh about 400 times a day thanks to Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Ladies and gentlemen, Americanisms like duh or whatever are but the tip of an iceberg. What I'm really concerned about is, the cultural, Protestant, anti-Catholic thinking that still lurks within this media, and that this is one of the key factors transforming Ireland, along with the New Age, which again I say is, above all, an Anglo-American phenomenon. I want to bring in a bit more autobiography. We've just been listening to this Irish lady illustrating her points of how she realizes she became Americanized growing up in Ireland in the 90s. And my experience gives witness to the same phenomenon from a different vantage point, in as much as I grew up in America in the 60s and 70s. I arrived in Europe in 1980. And my experience since coming to live in Europe, mainly England at first, has been to see Europe become more and more Americanized ever since. And I would say, above all, the UK and Ireland. The process is, less advanced in countries that I've lived in, like France and Spain, for obvious reasons. There are people today that will speak about Ireland being the 51st state, especially with these American tech giants here like Google. I think in Ireland, we really need to be thinking about why people call it the 51st state and the results of the GAFAization of Ireland. As I said, the French are so aware of the GAFAization, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazonization of their culture. Yeah, to come back to autobiography. So, when I first arrived in England, all kinds of Americanisms were not in use. People said hello, they didn't say hi. Or if you, bought stuff at the shop, you said thank you, the shop assistant didn't say you're welcome. Now, you're welcome is a rather nice Americanism. And these things are really, sort of very minor testimony to, a huge change underneath. But I've mentioned this before in episodes, but maybe it's worth mentioning it again. The England that I arrived in only had 3 television stations, which was, where I'd been in America was considerably more. And Ireland, I believe at that time, only had 2. And the Irish television stations were run by the state, RTE, obviously. England had the BBC, run by the state. But for me, it was striking to watch television that was not regularly, consistently interrupted by ads, every 9 or 10 minutes. Britain did have one station, ITV at the time, that was interrupted maybe every half an hour. And these things, all of this is now ubiquitous. Obviously these YouTube videos that you're watching, if you're watching them on YouTube, are interrupted by, ads. Again and again and again. And I'll just say this right now, I deplore this. If some of you think that I'm putting the ads on, you'll be wrong there. They are imposed now on small channels like my own. And what can I say? If you want to avoid them, you can go to my website and you can watch them without the ads. Thank God there. But my real point is that things that were once, very unusual in Britain and Ireland, all this commercialism and hyper-capitalism was not the norm 45 years ago, but it was the norm in the America I grew up in. So that is a way that, I see, my own biography shows me how, England and Ireland have become Americanized. I'm not trying to really blame Americans here. As this lady said, the Irish are a nation of copycats. Out of their own will, the Irish and the English began imitating these patterns. In the 80s, we had Margaret Thatcher, who was a great American copycat, or a great copycat of American, capitalism, really, in my view, destroying the country. This is Margaret Thatcher. This is not an American. And Margaret Thatcher was elected again and again and again. I mean, okay, she was only elected with something like 42% of the vote, but clearly, all kinds of British people at the time favoured the kind of process that Thatcher was leading the country down. I want to come back to what I said earlier, and now recorded a couple of days ago, about my concern about Ireland becoming a second-rate clone of the Anglo-American world. And in the last couple of days, since I recorded that, I've actually found a quote from an old article that James Connolly, 1916 Irish revolutionary, said that's relevant. Obviously, James Connolly would not be speaking about cloning, because cloning did not exist in 1908. But I'm just going to read you a brief quote from James Connolly. He writes, "The chief enemy of a Celtic revival today is the crushing force of capitalism, which irresistibly destroys all national or racial characteristics, and by sheer stress of its economic preponderance reduces a Galway or a Dublin, a Lithuania or a Warsaw to the level of a mere second-hand imitation of Manchester or Glasgow." So James Connolly was awakened to globalization then, although very much what he was concerned about was the Anglicization of Ireland. Ireland becoming, like Britain, like capitalist Manchester or capitalist Glasgow. These issues are still alive 100 years later, and of course, they are far, far worse. Contemporary Irish cultural attitudes owe far more to the liberalism stemming from London and Hollywood than is often acknowledged. And of course, economic liberalism is capitalism, and there's social liberalism. Very recently, and so I'm saying this in 2015, Ireland voted for same-sex marriage, quote-unquote marriage, I have it in the book, and the yes vote was carried by the young. In France and Spain, I noticed a marked difference, when I lived in France and Spain. There, the Anglo-American influence is comparatively much reduced, and even with the young, there are mighty movements against, so-called same-sex marriage that would confound the liberalised youth of Ireland today. And again, I argue that part of this is, Ireland being the 51st state, taking in, again, the kind of political correctness culture that the American left, the American universities have so powerfully communicated, through the organs of the American media. We're just going to read a few last pages, and I think we're actually going to read them in a rather uninterrupted fashion now. I just want to read to you what I was thinking and saying back in 2015, 9 years ago, without really trying to update it or supplement it very much. So, before closing my introduction, I write, I should like to venture a few last things about Ireland. My debt to this ancient Christian land is enormous. How much unfathomable treasure I have drawn from her profound wells of Christianity, and how my heart has been warmed by the uncommon kindness of her people. I have lived in 7 countries in all, and Irish society still strikes me, even today, as the most human. All this is beyond anything I can possibly express here in this introduction. Suffice it to say, I have a love affair with Ireland, and I consider this little book a love letter, a valentine for Catholic Ireland. However, it is not enough to wax maudlin. True love entails more than just sentimentality. It demands care, compassion, and effort for the beloved who suffers. Today, the Ireland that I love suffers greatly. I write these words in the latter half of 2015. As this country anticipates a milestone in her history, the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Easter Rising, which led to the modern Irish Republic. Today, secular Ireland appears distinctly uncomfortable with this centenary. There are different factors for this. Some strike me as noble in essence, at least essence, others less so. On the noble side, some feel the Rising was not a just war. They also rightly recoil at the terrible violence committed by the IRA in recent decades and start to wonder whether the 1916 revolutionaries, so Pierce and Connolly that we're speaking about, Emma de Valera, obviously, might be little more than terrorists. Truly, these attitudes would shock many of my fellow Americans who never entertained such thoughts about their own founding revolutionaries, even though the Irish Revolution was far less bloody than the American one. Less nobly, modern Ireland uses different routes to circumvent the, have this in quotes, the quote-unquote problem of 1916. One route is to dismiss the rebels as simply Catholic fanatics, whilst another is precisely the opposite. To claim the revolutionaries were, in fact, more groovy, progressive, and multicultural than the facts attest. Admittedly, Pierce's words in 1916 occasionally lend themselves to this sort of interpretation. However, the more I study the Rising, the more clearly I see what R.F. Forster wrote in his historical masterpiece, Modern Ireland. So this is a modern secular academic book of Irish history. And the author wrote, an intrinsic component of the insurrection, for all the pluralist window dressing of the proclamation issued by Pearse, was the strain of mystic Catholicism, identifying the Irish soul as Catholic and Gaelic. This notion is only strengthened by what transpired after the Rising. Upon achieving independence, Ireland opted, with vast popular support, for a far less secular system than Britain, one in which church and state were interwoven in ways unthinkable in other English-speaking countries. Thus, for example, new laws were passed by the new Irish state, again with democratic support, promoting tighter censorship and restricting divorce and the sale of contraceptives, amidst other measures favoured by the Catholic morality of the vast majority of Irish citizens at the time. So these things were voted in by the Irish population back then, democratically voted in, chosen. And of course there will be, modern progressives today who will claim that the problem is that the Irish back then were heavily propagandized by the power of a theocratic Vatican and the power of the church in Ireland at that time. There's no denying that the church was very powerful in Ireland at that time, and it seems that most of the Irish were very happy with that. Of course, what these kinds of arguments are completely missing is that however much you might construct an argument for the power of the Irish church at the time, what about the unbelievable propagandistic power of what we're calling symbolically here GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, or what Yanis Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism? What of the power of these internet giants and media makers today that have power undreamed of, with their 24/7 kind of coverage and with people with mobile phones all the time. This is, Ireland in the 20s and 30s where, all you had was the radio, no television, certainly no computers. Uncontestably, the propaganda is far, far more powerful in Ireland today than it ever has been. And yet there are people, of a liberal persuasion here arguing for Vatican and Catholic propaganda with no idea that their own liberal persuasions might be the result of the fact that they have been heavily propagandized from an early age with these round-the-clock, media that we now have. Anyway, in the book, another digression there, I go on to speak also about the 1937 Constitution. Drafted, the main force behind this was Eamon de Valera, who, of course, was one of the key revolutionaries in 1916, or I would say, again, counter-revolutionary. Pretty hard to paint de Valera as a kind of groovy, progressive, multicultural thinker. Pretty hard indeed. But anyway, let's look at that Constitution. As I say here, the Constitution rooted ultimate authority, not simply in the consent of the governed, but rather in the triune Christian God. And we're going to read it here, the preamble. In the name of the most holy Trinity, from whom is all authority, and to whom as our final end all actions both of men and states must be referred, we, the people of Eire, humbly acknowledging all our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ, who sustained our fathers through centuries of trial, gratefully remembering their heroic and unremitting struggle to regain the rightful independence of our nation, and seeking to promote the common good with due observance of prudence, justice, and charity, so that the dignity and freedom of the individual may be assured, true social order attained, the unity of our country restored, and concord established with other nations, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution. And then 6 years after, drafting this preamble, Edmond de Valera in 1943 gave a famous speech outlining the vision of Ireland which animated him long before the 1916 revolution. And we will quote de Valera. This is what was behind the revolution. The ideal Ireland that we would have, the Ireland that we dreamed of, would be the home of a people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living. Of a people who, satisfied with frugal comfort, devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit. A land whose countryside would be bright with cozy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contest of athletic youths, and the laughter of happy maidens, whose firesides would be forums for the wisdom of serene old age, the home, in short, of a people living the life that God desires that men should live. With the tidings that make such an Ireland possible, St. Patrick came to our ancestors 1500 years ago, promising happiness here no less than happiness hereafter. It was the pursuit of such an Ireland that later made our country worthy to be called the island of saints and scholars. It was the idea of such an Ireland, happy, vigorous, spiritual, that fired the imagination of our poets, that made successive generations of patriotic men give their lives to win religious and political liberty, and that will urge men in our own and future generations to die, if need be, so that these liberties may be preserved. What can I say? It is impossible to imagine any politician being elected today on a platform for a, quote, life of the spirit, satisfied with frugal comfort. Yet Catholic Ireland repeatedly re-elected the man. He spent 34 years as either Prime Minister or President of the country. Okay, continuing. Thus, for decades, Ireland swam against the tide of English-speaking culture elsewhere. Maybe we just do elaborate that briefly. It's not just the cultural things that I've invoked. For example, Ireland's censorship laws. So for example, in America, Hugh Hefner was pioneering, if that's the word, Playboy magazine in 1953, whereas, Playboy wasn't even legal in Ireland until 1995. So Ireland was clearly swimming against the Anglosphere current culturally. Britain legalized abortion in the 1960s, the Labour government. This has only just tragically happened, as we all know, in Ireland fairly recently. Ireland was swimming against the tide in these ways, but in other ways too. Ireland was obviously neutral in World War II. After World War II, when the sort of American-led world created the major financial institutions there, like, the International Monetary Fund, the Bretton Woods, Ireland didn't join the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs until 1967. It had a very protectionist culture. and was not, running the country, the way, the leading capitalist thinkers would have encouraged in the other Anglo-sphere countries. I mean, also, to this day, Ireland is not, and I thank God for this, part of the Anglosphere Five Eyes, the famous Five Eyes, which is a kind of Anglosphere intelligence gathering alliance comprising, the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. These Five Eyes gather this information. They don't share it with other countries. Ireland is not part of the Five Eyes. All of these things flow out of the 1916 revolution. Ireland was able to chart a very different course from the rest of the Anglosphere, rest of the Protestant, culturally Protestant anyway, Anglosphere countries. We owe all of this to 1916. All this started to unravel by the late 1960s. Obviously, increasingly globalized media and the sweeping changes elsewhere in the West played a part. Personally, however, I do not believe that the great transformation in the Catholic Church during the 1960s can be exonerated here. What would have happened in Ireland had the Church retained reverence in her liturgy and staunch adherence to devotions like the Sacred Heart, Benediction, Corpus Christi processions, holy water in the home, etc.? It is a question well worth pondering, especially as I increasingly suspect the old liturgy strengthened the clergy in a manner the new does not. Yeah, another thing we could develop, we'll develop at another time, but it's clear that restoring the liturgy is at the core of my thinking on this channel, and that I think the priests were actually strengthened by the old liturgy. At any rate, despite immense cultural and ecclesiastical changes worldwide, Ireland remained initially a place apart. How much that is so can be glimpsed from a 1974 survey which found over 90% of Catholics still attended Mass weekly, and nearly 47% went to confession once a month, whereas 97% prayed daily. 75% put up holy pictures or statues in their homes. Yeah, we don't have statistics for it, but again, holy water, that I just accidentally said, would have been in so many houses, all across the fields, all kinds of things blessed with holy water. Moreover, around a quarter of the population went to Mass more than once a week, and a similar proportion confessed every week. Today, however, all is changed utterly in Ireland. To borrow Yeats' famous refrain, Ireland has largely, if not completely, succumbed to the materialistic values that the 1916 revolutionaries fought to preserve her from. For, as Desmond Ryan, this is a close friend of Patrick Pearse, his secretary I believe, wrote, Patrick Pearse was concerned that the Irish people, Ryan says, had lost their souls and were being vulgarized, commercialized, anxious only to imitate the material prosperity of England. That was what the Rising was for Patrick Pearse. And I write, Patrick Pearse was hardly alone in this. Much of the Rising's impetus stemmed from the rebels' belief that without it, the soul of Ireland would slowly be extinguished by British governance, British capitalism, and British education. I realize much that I say here and elsewhere in this book will be contentious in Ireland today, even inflammatory. Assuming my book achieves any notice here, I expect to be hated for this book. in certain quarters of modern Ireland? If so, the things I would be hated for are mainly things the majority of Irish people held sacred 50 years ago. This would simply show then that modern Ireland hates its own past and its own traditions, which is something immensely tragic. Okay, final 4 paragraphs now. There is little scope to say more. Still, I pray this small book will serve notice that there are those still living in Ireland who remain wondrous that 1916 led to an extraordinary situation, an Irish state which firmly rejected the values of the increasingly secularized, materialistic culture elsewhere. To my mind, the extraordinary kindness and humanness I still see in this country is inextricably connected to the Catholic culture that once thrived here. That culture, whilst fallen, with dark corners like every culture, fostered a wholesome community spirit and charity, which still persist in Ireland today, particularly in rural areas. Frankly, it takes my breath away. Even though, with the ongoing destruction of that Catholic culture, there is increased greed, despair, family and social breakdown, crime, suicide, and more. Many Irish people note these trends and mourn for Ireland the way I mourn. However, I do not believe that all is yet lost. Yes, my life in Latin Catholic countries, again, mainly France, Spain, showed me how Irish Catholicism is uniquely vulnerable to the once Protestant, now secular, liberal, Anglo-American tidal wave. France isn't vulnerable in the same way. And of course, the immense power of global corporations and media now menace Catholic culture everywhere. Many times have I feared this small island simply does not have the wherewithal to stand against this colossus. Yet the longer I live amidst St. Patrick's people, the more hope I gain. For I see ever more clearly the profondeur of the Catholic and Christian roots of this nation since the coming of St. Patrick 1600 years ago. Much urgently needs doing to protect these roots, and I hope this small book may serve to water these roots a little. Thus, wherever you may be in the world, dear reader, I ask you to join me in prayer for the soul of Ireland. For Ireland has long been a beacon of light in the Anglosphere. That light may be diminished, but it is not extinguished. Pray with me then, I beg you, that the tree St. Patrick planted long ago may once more burst into bloom. Summing up, what's this all about? Counter-revolution. But again, the ideal of counter-revolution is not violence, but it is resistance. Resistance that is intense and committed. Resistance can take many forms. One of the things that I am so moved today that I see starting to happen in Ireland is Catholic families home educating their children to protect their children from the horrendous things going on in the mainstream education in Ireland. Counter-revolution can take so many forms, but the key to it all is prayer. Prayer. And of course, the sacraments. And on this channel, I encourage people to receive the sacraments as frequently as possible, because it will put fire in you. You know, it will also heal you. But to return to the traditional Catholic patterns that shaped Ireland, that we spoke about earlier, you know, where Catholics went to Mass daily, or they prayed their rosary. You know, these patterns will save Ireland. We need to pray for Ireland and participate as deeply as we can in the sacraments. This is at the utter core of a genuine counter-revolution. I'd also say that we need to be as aware and as awake as possible to the challenges the secular and materialistic world is presenting to us. And it seems to me that we all have different gifts to bring to this process of awareness and awakeness and raising consciousness. I think that there are certain things that I can bring as an outsider to Ireland, but, you know, gifts from my own, you know, providential life course, my own biography. God orders our lives so that we may learn certain things. And I would like to say that I do feel I've learned a lot from having an experience that many people in this country don't have. You know, coming from a culturally Protestant American background, English parents, you know, Anglo background, sort of fading into the New Age, you know, really seeing that kind of culturally Protestant, Anglo-American New Age culture, and then converting, finding the Catholic mystery, and not only seeing the difference like night and day, but now seeing what this culturally Protestant world, New Age world, is doing to Ireland. I can maybe see that in a way that not everyone can. You know, a little brief digression. I was speaking to people recently who don't really see the New Age so well in Ireland. The New Age, as I've said before, New Agers rarely speak about the New Age movement anymore. They used to. Look for words like wellness, spirituality, mindfulness. There you'll get a sense of how the New Age movement, with its roots in Anglo-America, is tearing through Ireland. So I can bring things like that. I would like to think, bring things to the table that maybe certain other people with a different set of gifts and a different set of life lessons cannot so easily bring. We need to learn from all different kinds of people what they can, bring to the table. I'd also like to say something about reading books, because I think the past is very important. If you are continuously just with social media, YouTube echo chambers, you may get to know a lot about contemporary events, but you may really be missing a lot about the past. As Winston Churchill said, those who fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We need to know about the past. The present is growing out of the past, and the only in-depth way to do that, I think, is to read books. So I'll note that I brought up certain books in this episode, like Puritan's Empire by, my friend Charles Coulombe, has so much to say about how not just America has been shaped by its Puritan origins, the people coming over on the Mayflower, how there is this consistent strain of Puritanism, capitalism coming out of Calvinism, how this kind of Puritan Calvinistic spirit persists in America, and how it persists in the American culture, spreading across the planet. Book like this, can maybe give us real insights that a lot of YouTubers, are not going to be able to give us. So I wanted to flag that again, all right? But I'm also going to, in summing up this episode, bring up again the classic book by Hilaire Belloc, Monarchy, recently republished by Aroka Press, with, yes, a 40-page introduction by yours truly. This book is about monarchy, obviously. specifically the French monarchy. But in the course of it, it has so much to say about 1688, this year that Belloc argues transformed the West, the year that capitalism came to dominate in England like never before, where the last Catholic king of, Britain was eliminated, and a puppet king was put on the throne, and the capitalists could go to town like never before. And Belloc really argues in this book how this too has shaped not only Britain, but the entire Anglosphere. Yes, including Ireland, because after that, you had the Battle of the Boyne, the penal laws, and Irish Catholicism was incredibly suppressed in the past, like it is being suppressed again now. A lot can be learned from books like this. Then I also mentioned this book, The Saga of Ireland, and I want to just say a little bit about this. This is a book that has only just appeared in the last month or two. I haven't even finished reading it myself, to be honest, but I've read most of it, and what I've seen has really impressed me. Key to this book, the subtitle, is a concise history of the Emerald Isle, and I'm going to stress that word concise, because the book attempts to cover in 500 pages or so a sort of bird's eye history of Ireland. So it's not going into close detail on a lot of things. It's also simple or simplifying things, because you have to do that in a book like this, but it gives you the big picture of what Ireland has been. I should also mention that the book's audience, it says on the back, it's intended for ages 11 and up. I think that it will be a very fine book for children being home educated in Ireland today. But I'm 60, and I've read a lot of history, Irish history, and I still got a lot from it. One thing I say is the author, Philip Campbell, is a born educator. I think that he really knows how to make key points accessible, easy to grasp. The book is very, very readable. I really recommend it. I will just mention that Philip Campbell is an American. There might be some people who would question an American, outside Ireland, writing a book about Ireland. I wouldn't. The book is very, very clearly a labour of love, a man with a passion for Ireland. That's very clear from the book. Something else I'm also going to say is the book is written from a traditional Catholic perspective, and that's obviously important. What I would point out is, you could have some, maybe in some ways brilliant Irish academic who's lived in Ireland their whole life, and if they don't understand the Catholic mystery, from the inside, as Philip Campbell obviously does, they are missing so much that is key to what Ireland is. So here is a book, written very evidently by a faithful Catholic who understands the Catholic essence of this country, and, I want to recommend it. I want to recommend reading as widely as possible. Read all kinds of things, from the left to the right. Don't get yourself trapped in echo chambers. This is very, very important, but certainly, let us rejoice in traditional Catholic authors who are not becoming bogged down in the materialism that permeates, nearly all secular academic books. Important as they are, we need to remember that these books are permeated by materialism. This affects, the whole way history is written. This was Belloc's point, that so much of British history was materialistic and very Protestant in tone. But we won't keep going on about that. I will just finally mention a comic book. And the comic book, of course, that I want to mention is, I've spoken about it before, I've been reading from it, my book, The Gentle Traditionalist, because most of the book is not like what I've been reading to you today. Most of the book, as I've said before, is like a comic book without pictures. It's also designed to be very readable, very accessible, can be read in the course of a weekend, really, quite easily. And yeah, it's really like a set of fictional dialogues. It is fiction, but very little actually happens in the fiction. People mainly speak about the very ideas that I'm speaking about on this channel, the ideas of Catholic counter-revolution and Catholic tradition. This is laid out in this book, as I say, almost in comic book form. So there, a final plug for my own book. I want to say that you can find all my books at my Amazon author page, which I'll bring up here on the screen. So you can find my books there. I will give links to the other books that I've mentioned down below. And final thing I want to say is that we do also have a Buy Me a Coffee page where you can make a small contribution to our work if you like. Many of us are struggling in these trying times, but if you're not struggling and you'd like to support our work in a small way, you can buy us a coffee. If you could do that easily for us, we'd be very grateful to you. So link down below for that as well. But now, in closing, I just want to say thank you for watching, and pray. Please pray for Ireland. Pray for Ireland.